Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Meet an Astronomer here at Lowell Observatory. My name is Danielle Adams, and I am a cultural astronomer and the Deputy Director for Marketing and Communications here at the Observatory. I'd like to give a shout out to APS, who is a sponsor of this episode of Meet an Astronomer. And today we're going to talk about cultural astronomy. Now, this is basically the anthropology of astronomy. So instead of studying the composition of stars and how far away they are, etc., I study how people interact with the night sky. And so today we're going to look at Arabian astronomy long ago, about 1400, 1500 years ago. And we're going to look at the many layers of meaning that Arabs had in the night sky, as well as the different uses for the stars. So let's get started. First, I'm going to be talking about something called the flattened sky. And what I mean by this is that we can very broadly define astronomy as a shared way of relating to the night sky. And astronomos literally means star arranging. So when we look at astronomy in this way, then we can actually use astronomy in the plural and talk about how there are many astronomies in the world, i.e. systems of arranging the stars in the night sky across different cultures. So let's take a look at this. This is a star field. And right now, as we look at this, these are all points of light. These are data points. And we could put these together in many different ways. As we look at the modern night sky tonight, we'll see that it's put together in a very specific way. So we have a number of star names assigned to the brighter several hundred stars. And these star names have a variety of origins. Some come from Latin, some come from Greek. Most of the star names we see in the night sky come from Arabic. And some of those star names in Arabic are pointing to Arabian astronomy, while other Arabic origin star names are pointing towards Greek astronomy. So we have this mess of culture already in the night sky, just looking at the star names. Now, as we go further, we connect the dots, and our modern view of the night sky is a Greek view of the sky. So we have Greek constellations, some of which originate in Babylonia and Mesopotamia. And then on top of these constellations, then in the modern night sky, we actually define constellations not as the stars that are connected, but as areas of sky in which stars occupy. So basically, any object in the sky can be in one and only one constellation. Everything has its place. And so we have essentially a flattened view of the night sky. It's kind of like if you imagine working in Photoshop and you have an image with multiple layers and different elements going into the image, and then you click that selection that says flatten image. You can no longer see where the different elements come from. It's all one layer and everything has its one place. Now, this is really useful when you're communicating across many different cultures, different countries and languages, and you all need to make sure that you're talking about the very same thing. But long ago, this is not how the sky was seen. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to reconstruct some of these flattened images of the night sky to see the textures that were there long ago. And so we're going to pull apart the flattened image and really look at what we call multivalent textures. So let's take a look at what multivalency is. Multivalency means that one thing has different meanings in different contexts. So long ago in the Arabian Peninsula, we can see, for example, this group of 4 stars that's towards the bottom of your screen. Again, these are points of light. We could call these anything. We could connect them in different ways. But we'll take these 4 points of light, these 4 stars, and look at how long ago in Arabia, they had 4 different names depending on the context in which they were used. Now, we call these 4 points of light an asterism. It's just a small group of stars, and we're not going to use the term constellation very much in this talk, and we'll get into why a little bit later. But let's place these 4 dots in the nighttime sky. All right, there we go. Now, one name that was used for this group of stars was the tent, el-khibat. It looks like a 4-posted tent a little bit. Now, if we look at this, we see that there were other stars around the tent that are connected to it in terms of meaning. So in fact, there was a whole campsite in the night sky. So next to the tent, you can see a curved arc of stars, and that curved arc of stars, was called the manger, el-ma'laf. And then there's a line, kind of a jagged line of stars next to it, to the right from our perspective here. That was a line of tied camels called a sharasif. And then the very bright star on the rightmost edge of the line of tied camels was called al-fard. And that was called the solitary camel. So in fact, here we have a scene of the night sky that is a campsite. A bunch of camels tied up after a long day caravanning, and they have a manger nearby from which to get food, and then there's a tent right there as well. So I'm going to refer to groups of stars like this as a celestial complex. So constellation just doesn't work well here. In fact, we have a number of different figures that have their own connections. They draw their own things in the sky, but they're connected by meaning to each other to make this essentially sky picture. It sets a scene in the night sky. So I'll use the term celestial complex for these sorts of things. So in this celestial complex of the campsite, these 4 stars were the tent, el-khibat. Now, they were also called the lambs, el-ahmal. And we actually don't have any context for this. So we don't know if there were other things around that were connected to this and have been lost to the ravages of time. So for now, we just know these 4 stars also as the lambs. A third term is the throne of the sky raiser. So this obviously needs some more explanation. In the night sky, there were 2 bright stars, and you see them connected by a dotted line here. These were the 2 sky raisers. And in Arabic, that term is simak. And it has to do with the poles that would be used to raise the roof of a tent. And so as these 2 stars climbed in the sky, when they were more or less due south, they were so high in the sky that they were imagined to be the endpoints of a great tent pole that held up the canopy of the heavens. So pretty poetic there. Now the top one has some stars connected with it that form a spear. And so that one was the spear-bearing sky raiser. The bottom one has no spear, and so it was called the unarmed sky raiser. And so in this context, our group of 4 stars were seen to be the throne of the sky raiser. Because it's a little bit lower in the sky, it would be seen as the seat or the throne of this unarmed sky raiser. So that's number 3. And then we go to number 4. Number 4, this group of 4 stars were seen to be the rump of the lion. And the lion was a massive asterism in the night sky. Actually, here I would actually use the word mega constellation. It was so large that when it was up in the sky, it took up 3/4 of the length of the sky from east to west, 135 angular degrees. And so the great lion in the sky had many different parts. You can see on the right, we start at claws and 2 arms, and they go back to a head, a mane. Actually, there's also a nose. These 2 faint stars were called the 2 nostrils, and there's a star cluster there called M44 in modern-day Cancer that was seen to be the sneeze of the lion, literally dust particle cloud that was sneezed out from the 2 nostrils. And then we go back, we have the mane. I've got the body going back into the legs or shanks of the lion, and a tail, which is another rather large and bright star cluster. So this was the lion. I don't know why the rump was so far away. This is probably a later development, but at some point the same group of 4 stars was called the rump of the lion. And so this is a really good example of multivalency, because the same group of 4 stars was called the rump of the lion, the throne of the sky raiser, the tent, and the lambs. So 4 names for 1 asterism, and this is the multivalency of meaning. 1 object with different meanings used in different contexts. So we'll talk now about stars as cultural texts. And I'm going to refer to this term called chronotope. And this relates to the interconnectedness of time, chronos, and space, topos. This was a term that was coined by Mikhail Bakhtin long ago, who used the term in a literary context to talk about time and space being connected within literary settings. So a classic example of this is a group of travelers on a road. And as they make progress walking down the road, they are moving through space while consuming time as they go down the road. And so that is a literary trope. And so you see this used time and time again, going back a long ways in literature. And we can then look at how in Arabic poetry, this was used in the classical Arabic qasida, or long poem, which has a very formulaic structure. And so let me read to you the first few lines of a poem by Imru al-Qais, who died in 544 CE, so about a little bit less than 1,500 years ago. So the poem begins this way. Stop and let us mourn the remembrance of my beloved and her abode on the twisted desert slope between Ad-Dakhul and Hawmal, as well as Tudih and El-Mikrat, for its traces were not effaced when the north and south winds blew, sand crisscrossing over them. You see the droppings of the white antelope in its courtyards and corridors as if they were grains of pepper. So here we essentially have the poet going through the desert, and then when he arrives at the ruined abode of his beloved, this triggers memories of her. And so we have something in space that's connected with time, and it's triggering that remembrance. We can also look further, and Keith Basso was a linguistic anthropologist who applied the chronotope to different landscapes of the Western Apache. And he found that certain landscape features were culturally significant and reminded them of different elements of their history. And so they were applied as moral teachings. So here we have points in the local geography of the Western Apache that connect time and space. It's where time and space are fused. And so we have a chronotope. And so I'm going to use the term, oops, that disappeared. I'm going to use the term celestial chronotope. Let me just go back here a moment. To talk about a cultural meaning applied to the stars. So it's going to look at stars in essentially the celestial geography, the sky, whose appearance in time and space embodies a certain type of cultural significance. And like the landscapes of the Western Apache, it's through the celestial chronotope that star stories are told. So we're going to look at three categories of chronotope, or celestial chronotope. The first is the guide star. The second is the celestial clock. And the third is the seasonal forecaster. So we'll look at the guide star first. Now, this celestial chronotope is based on stars whose positions don't change very much, so that they reliably indicate a certain direction. So here we're looking north, and you can probably spot the North Star in the center of our screen. Now, if we go back to about 600 CE, we'll see that, in fact, there was no North Star. So here you see a projection of the axis of the Earth and coordinate system onto the night sky. And we're going to go back 100 years with each tick here. And we'll see that the axis of the Earth actually pointed to an empty space in the sky, not to the North Star as we know it today. This is the result of something called precession of the equinoxes. It takes about 26,000 years for our North Celestial Pole to trace the circle through the sky. It's basically like the Earth is a top that is wobbling, but it takes 26,000 years to wobble one time. So here, in this time period, since there was no single North Star, North was indicated by a group of stars. And so the one on the bottom was called the Goat Kid, Al-Jadi in Arabic. And then on the other side, there were two together that were called the two wild cow calves, Al-Farqadan. And together, these three stars danced around the North Celestial Pole. And so together, they indicated the direction of north. Now, that Arabic term, Al-Farqadan, survives as the star name Farqad. And the other of that pair of stars, today we call Kokab, which in Arabic just means star. So those some of those names have survived to our modern day astronomy. Now, these stars were used by camel caravan drivers as they crossed the desert. And if you've ever been in a large desert like the Sahara, the sand dunes in the desert actually move over time because they're blown by wind. And so, just as you're out in the open seas, especially traveling by night, you need the stars to guide you. So we're going to watch here as these three stars rotate around the North Celestial Pole. And you'll see the Goat Kid, our North Star, actually moving in the night sky. Okay, so we've got the Goat Kid and the two wild cow calves. Now, we're going to trace out what may be a familiar asterism here. This is the bucket of what you may know as the Big Dipper. In Arabia, during this time, this was called the bier, a nash. And the bier was basically a bed that they would carry someone who had died. And behind the bier, we have 3 stars that together were called the children, el-banat. And so altogether, the asterism was called Banat Nash, the children of the bier. And sometimes this was called Banat Nash al-Kubra because they also recognized that there was a similar asterism, which we would see as the Little Dipper, and this was called Banat Nash al-Sukhra, the children of the smaller bier. Now, looking at, again, this idea of multivalency, each of the 3 stars that were the children were seen to have their own individual names that go back to animals once again. And so this closest one, was called Al-Jaun, which is the black camel or the black horse. The middle one was called the she-kid, Al-Anak. And the last one on the handle was called the leader, Al-Qa'id. And today this still bears the name Al-Qaid, referring back to the leader. Now, these stars were used, again, to indicate the direction of north. So we have some examples that I can share with you from the Arabic poetry. So Al-Asha, who was a poet who died in 629, said, "For when she set out at nightfall, she was seeing 2 watchers, the goat kid, which does not set, and the wild cow calf." The Uruma, who died in 735, said, "They kept to the left of the goat kid of the wild cow calves during the night travels, and to the right of something that was on the right side of the western horizon." And then over time, this notion of using these stars to indicate the direction of north also became something that was figurative to indicate permanence and steadfastness. So the poet Hadrami said, "And by the life of your father, every brother will withdraw from his own brother, except for the 2 wild cow calves." So these stars were so steadfast that they would not leave you, even if your own brother would leave you. And then we see this also in the case of these other stars. So Bishr ibn Abi Khazim, who died around 598 CE, said, "I gaze upon the children of the bier in the sky when it has turned like the camel mother inclines towards its young." So he's talking about its rotation around the North Celestial Pole. Now, near these 3 stars, we see the middle one, the she-kid, actually has a fainter star that's rather close to it. And this fainter star was called Asuha, the overlooked one. And it was used as a test of eyesight. In fact, across many different cultures, this has been used as a test of eyesight, these 2 stars. And so there was a saying that said, "I show her the overlooked one, and she shows me the moon." Presumably, this was used among lovers. And just checking in on the questions on chat here, I see you've got a question: were any stars named after a person or a group of people? We do have stars that were named for particular people in the night sky. We can't connect them historically to any one particular person, but there were some, there are some figures that were indicating people rather than animals. All right, so near the children of the larger bier and the children of the smaller bier, we've got an interesting scene here in the night sky. So here, another group of 4 stars was seen to be the Camel Mothers, El-Awa'id. and a faint star in the middle was the young camel, Aruba. Now, these camels were threatened by a pair of wolves. And so the camel mothers are surrounding the young camel to protect that camel from the wolves. And then another bright star nearby, the alighting vulture, Nasr al-Waqia, also came in to help rescue this young camel. Now, this Arabic term, Nasr al-Waqia, the last word of this, al-Waqia, over time became Vega. And so this is the bright star Vega. All right, so those are some examples of stars in the northern sky. We're now going to look at the second kind of celestial chronotope, the celestial clock. And this here is based on the changing position or aspect of stars through the night. So when you look at a star chart, the stars don't change with respect to each other. In fact, they are all moving, but they are so far away that their motions are imperceptible to the naked eye and very slightly noticeable depending on how close they are and how fast they are moving in telescopes over periods of time. So the stars are fixed, we call them. But through the night, the stars always move the same way. And so you can connect the position of a star in relation to the ground as a reference point, or you can look at a certain asterism and see how its aspect changes through the night. So I'm going to set this star field in motion, and I want you to take a look at this group of stars, which you may know as the Pleiades star cluster. In Arabia, this was called a Thuraya, which is a bit of a proper name, but it likely goes back to dual meanings of moisture and also abundance. And so we'll see that this has some meaning in relation to seasonal forecasting later on. But let's set this star field in motion. So we have a Thuraya. Oh, and let me identify some other characters as well. The bright star in the middle of the screen was called, actually many different names. One of them was the follower, Aldebaran, and you may recognize it as the star Aldebaran. It was the follower of a Thuraya. So it was imagined to be following a Thuraya across the sky. And then another bright star was called the Impeder, El Ayuk. And there's a story that we'll talk about a little bit later. But let's get these in motion. And so you can see we've lost the horizon as the stars rose, and now the aspect is changing with respect to the observer. So now we're about the middle of the sky. And whereas this cluster was oriented more vertically in the beginning, now it's more horizontal. And so let's go a little bit further. And then you'll see them get ready to set and approach the ground. And so now we have the star cluster. Again, its aspect has changed. Now it's oriented sort of upper left to bottom right. But notice that the fat part is now on the bottom and the thin part is on the top. Whereas when it first rose, the thin part was on the bottom and the fat part was on the top. So just this can give us some indication from the poetry. So an old piece of poetry by Imru al-Qais, who died in 544, says, "When a Thuraya inclined obliquely in the sky like the variegated gems of a beaded sash, whose folds drape from shoulder to opposing waist. So this description of this star cluster called a Thuraya only makes sense when it's getting ready to set, because the description of the folds draping like a beaded sash, it would be gathered at the upper left and then drape down to the opposite waist or opposite side of the body over to the bottom right. So here, just from looking at the aspect change, we can tell where in the sky the description is being made by the poet. And so here again, we have the impeder, the follower, and a Thuraya. Now, there is a really interesting story about these characters. And basically, a Thuraya was seen as a female figure, and the impeder was trying to prevent the follower, a male figure, from getting together with a Thuraya. And so the impeder is always above them, watching over them, and preventing the two from getting together. And so forever the follower pursues a Thuraya, but never actually reaches her. And so we have also an interesting story from Abu Dhu'ayb, who died in 648 CE. And he says, so down they came to the water, while in this impeder above a Thuraya, to the one who oversaw those who gambled with divining arrows and thus sat above and behind them. And so we can actually go back using planetarium software and take a look at how these stars would be seen at that time, and from the latitudes where Abu Dhu'ayb lived, and get some information about what he could have meant here in the night sky. Some variations of this story uses, instead of a Thuraya, another asterism that doesn't quite fit the positions that you see here in the sky. Now, if we go and look more in depth at a Thuraya, we'll see that over time, the star cluster was anthropomorphized with two great arms. One was called the amputated hand, al-Kaf al-Jadma, and there's a star there that today is still called Kaf al-Jadma. This was a shorter arm, and there's no fingers or hand or anything that we can point out. Now, the other arm is longer because it was not amputated. This is the henna-dyed hand. And at the end, we see the star Kaf, which means hand in Arabic. And it was called henna-dyed because this star next to Kaf is a orangish-colored star, as you see it with the naked eye. And so it was reminiscent of henna, which was used to dye people's hands and feet. And then the circle here is highlighting a double star cluster that was seen to be the tattoo on the wrist of this henna-dyed hand, Washim el-Ma'sam in Arabic. And then there were many points of articulation along the hand. One in particular was the elbow, which in Arabic is el-Mirfaq, and that survives today as the bright star Mirfaq in the constellation Perseus. But there were other points. There was the tip of the elbow, the pit of the elbow, the shoulder blade, the upper arm, the lower arm, and these likely developed over time. But here we have a Thuraya anthropomorphized with two great arms. And so now that we can see this in the sky, we can read a piece of poetry from Ruma, who died in 735. And he says, "Won't Mai come at night to the one amorously mystified by the mention of her name, when the hands of a Thuraya dip toward the western places of sunset?" And so this is the picture that he's thinking of. We have the two hands of Thuraya dipping towards the western horizon getting ready to set. And so he uses the position of these stars to set the time of night for this piece of poetry. This actually was one of the verses that got me most interested in cultural astronomy, and especially looking at Arabian astronomy when I was studying Arabic in Beirut some time ago, figuring this out, that this was not just a figurative piece of poetry, but was actually literally describing the night sky, was pretty incredible. And so now we're going to look at the third kind of celestial chronotope that was used in Arabia. And this is the seasonal forecaster. And we're going to look at two kinds. One is going to be setting rain stars, and the other rising stars. So we'll look at setting rain stars. So before we get going here on this, we need to talk about a term in Arabic called ghalas. And ghalas is a term that describes a particular time of night. We can find it probably in the range of 45 to 60 minutes or so before sunrise. It's a time where the darkness of the night mixed with the light of dawn. And so the term in Arabic has to do with white mixing with red and darkness. So for example, again, the same poet, Ruma, says, at the moment when the star, or a thuraya, that star cluster, had culminated in the waning darkness, ghalas is what he uses there, when the herbage had ripened for harvest, some bent and some harvested already. So here he's talking about that specific time, the waning darkness of the night. And so we're going to look at just an example here of several that do exist of setting rain stars. Now, this square that you see hovering over the western horizon was called a delu, which means the well bucket. You might recognize it as the square of Pegasus. But this asterism is a very large, almost perfect square of stars, bright stars. And this had a really interesting place in ancient Arabian astronomy. So altogether, it was the well bucket. And the front two stars had a number of names. In the very beginning, they were called the front two crossbars. They were also called the front spout or the first spout. And then the next two stars were called the rear two crossbars or the rear spout or second spout. And so what's happening here is, although you may think of a well bucket as, something round and, maybe metal, dunk it into a well and pull the water out. When you're traveling through the desert, that really takes up a lot of space. And so camel caravans, as they went through the desert, they would use something different for a well bucket. They would take a leather pouch and they would cross two sticks at the mouth of the pouch. And so what you get is essentially a square-shaped opening to this leather pouch. And then they would tie them together in the middle and connect that to the well rope. And that is what you would dunk into the water and pull up to get your water. And so it's a soft leather well bucket. And this is well represented here in the night sky. Now, what's really wonderful here is that the well bucket was used to indicate at its setting during this special time of ghalas, it indicated heavy rains. So we see here a piece of poetry from Adi bin Zayd, who died in 587. He says, during the autumnal season of fruit harvest, a rain period from the well bucket sent to him rain while the crossbars hung down low in the sky, but were not yet concealed. So this is pretty much the view that he is describing here. And so we have this beautiful figurative view of the well bucket hanging low in the sky, dumping water out onto the earth as seasonal heavy rains of autumn are appearing. So really nice imagery there. And then we'll look at our friend Athuraya. So I mentioned earlier that the name Athuraya has something to do with abundance and also moisture. Those are two different Arabic roots that are connected here to this old name. And so when Athuraya was setting at this time of Ghalas, it indicated the onset of the Wasmi rains. And the Wasmi rains were called Wasmi because it comes from the Arabic term wasama, which is a verb that means to mark. And so this happened in two ways. One, the rains were so heavy that they literally marked the desert with divots as their heavy, fast water droplets hit the ground. But then the result of that was that the Wasmi rains marked the desert with green as different plants came to life again. And I lived in Tucson, Arizona for about 12 years. And I can tell you that, you know, in the middle of the summer, when you're waiting for the monsoon rains to come, everything is dry and barren. And then when those rains come, some plants turn green almost overnight, just a few days, and you have Ocotillo just in beautiful green all over the place. So these rains literally marked the desert with green. And so Athuraya has this meaning of abundance and moisture as it was setting. Now we'll look at, and then of course we also have the follower here behind it. And then we'll look at rising stars. And this is a really interesting piece. So when we look at setting stars, usually this appears in the poetry. But when we look at rising stars, these usually appear in what's called rhymed prose. It's perhaps one of the earliest forms of Arabic poetry. But it doesn't fit into a precise meter like Arabic poetry normally would, but it rhymes at the end. So here, as an example, it says, when the star rises, the summer is vehement and the herbage is brittle. But listen to it in Arabic. إذا طلع النجم فالصيف في حدم والعشب في حتم. So you can hear that rhyme at the end of each verse. And here the star is indicating Athuraya. And so here we have the rising of Thuraya at a different time of year when things were getting very hot, I believe around May. And then also along the same lines, we have the follower. And so this rhymed prose says, when the follower rises, the rugged lands abounding in jagged rocks became vehemently hot and the flies spread like fire. So we have these very descriptive elements of the weather at the rising of these different stars. All right, so this has been a tour of some important elements of the Arabian night sky, looking at different ways in which these stars were used in a practical sense for navigation, for telling the time of night, and also for indicating seasonal change. And then, of course, we looked at in the beginning this idea of multivalency as the different stars were seen to have different meanings depending on the context in which they were used. So we'll take a look at some questions now. One, I'm sure you mentioned it, but what is the meaning of beer in these asterisms? Yes, so for the children of the larger beer and the children of the smaller beer, the beer is that basically wooden bed that would be used to carry a dead person, like a stretcher almost, that would be used to carry the dead person in the funeral procession through the streets or through the village to the burial site. And so the family would follow behind. And so those asterisms were seen to be the children or members of the family following that funeral bier. Another question from Jonathan Ford. It's interesting that many stars have Arabic names, while many constellations are derived from the Greeks. Do we know how this combination came to be used? Yes. So this gets into a many century long progression as our modern night sky was built. But essentially, we see here from what we've seen today that in Arabia, sometimes an individual star had a name. Other times it was part of a larger group, and the group together had a name, but not the individual stars. So what happens is over time, after the introduction of Greek astronomy through a very massive translation program that was initiated about 100 years or so into Islam, we have all of this science from the Greeks being translated. And over time, their sky pictures came to be translated and eventually adopted as the correct sky pictures in the night sky. And there's a whole history behind that that probably deserves another talk. But so as time goes on, different maps of the night sky were created. The earliest one we have is from a Sufi who lived in the 900s. And so we see that as he made maps of the night sky, he would use oftentimes indigenous Arabic names to describe individual stars while outlining the Greek sky pictures of the constellations. And so here we have a mixture of the Arabic star names from Arabian astronomy and the Greek pictures of the night sky. And then that information over more centuries got translated into Latin. And so that's where we get a lot of these Arabic star names being present in the night sky through Latin translations. And then, of course, the Greek sky pictures endured. And then over more time, then we have the rediscovery of the original Greek documents like Ptolemy's Almagest. And so we have the restoration of the Greek constellations into these star charts that were propagating throughout Europe, but while still also using these Arabian star names. Okay, another question. Can you recommend any books on the topic? Haha. Okay, so this is a problem, and I'm trying to solve it, but I need to get some time to write some of these books. So one of the difficulties is that most of the books that address star names do so in a fragmented manner. So they'll look at, say, a Greek picture of the night sky. So they may look at Orion and then go star by star and identify the different names and the derivation of those names. But from this, you don't really get a sense of how the Arabian stars were connected. Sometimes it's a little bit similar to the Greek pictures, but most times it's not at all similar. And so there's really a dearth of material that explains this in a good way. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to get to, is to get some books out there that really describe the full Arabian picture of the night sky. So this is what I did in my dissertation a couple of years ago, and I'm hoping to turn that into a book in the short time here. Another question. Okay. Is Egyptian star lore similar to Arabian lore, considering Egypt, while near Arabia, is almost Mediterranean? Okay, so a curious thing happened. If you look at the Levant, like modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, that region of the world was conquered so many times. It's right in the middle of trade routes, access to the ocean, and so there's many different cultural influences there. But in the Arabian deserts, which is much of modern day Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, in that region, it's just huge deserts with places around the edges near water that were more fertile. And so through history, a lot of these conquering armies just didn't go down into the desert. So a lot of what we see in Arabian astronomy is very likely indigenous and came right out of Arabia there. Now, some of it, we can identify connections to Babylonian or Mesopotamian astronomy. And so with those, for example, Scorpius, that you may know, the Arabs saw Scorpius as a scorpion, but with pincers, which are modern day Libra. And this goes back to Mesopotamian astronomy, where we can see the scorpion as well. And there are some other examples as well of similar constellations or celestial complexes in the night sky. So there does appear to have been some borrowing, but a lot of what we see is really unique to the Arabian Peninsula. So in terms of Egyptian star lore, there are books on Egyptian star lore and a lot of articles in the recent 10 years or so about Egyptian astronomy. And that was very different in most ways from Arabian astronomy, again, because of that geographical separation. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. And then I will say, for my dissertation research, some part of it was funded in part by the NASA Space Grant Program, which is a really great program. And for that program, I built a website that, in truth, I need to update with the final results of my research. But you can see it at onesky.arizona.edu. And so that will give you some more images of the night sky, especially around the equatorial region of the night sky, where a lot of this business with the rain stars and the rising stars has to do. All right. Well, it looks like there are no other questions. Thank you so much for joining me today to learn about cultural astronomy and Arabian astronomy in particular. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us for Meet an Astronomer. Be sure to join us next week when our director, Jeff Hall, will talk about his research into solar astronomy. Thanks so much.